I work as a machinist helper. The work is not easy, but I like it. I recently finished my training and got the job straight away. It's not bad for a 20-year-old guy, plus there is career growth. My work schedule includes a lot of night shifts. I'm going to tell you about one of those nights today. It happened about 2 years ago, in the middle of January. I started working independently and was transferred to a large station, not far from the city. Today I have a night shift. All day I was watching TV series on my laptop, and again I forgot to sleep before work. This means that at night I'll be fighting the urge to sleep especially hard again. I was distracted from watching the show by a phone call. It was my boss, the train driver. A jolly, balding older man. A very experienced and professional man. I picked up the phone. He said he couldn't make it to work today. He urgently needed to go to town to see his brother, and another driver would replace him today. The supervisor's voice was a little different from usual. He was breathing more frequently than usual, stuttered occasionally, and sounded as if he were scared. I listened to him and continued watching the show. A couple more hours passed. I ate, got ready, and went to work. The machinist I was to work with tonight was already waiting for me in the office. He was a tall, dense guy, 26 years old. Like me, he had recently finished his studies and came here. After the briefing and other preparations, we went to our car. He told us that today we'd be hauling wagons of crushed stone. I wasn't surprised. It's not a difficult task, and it's perfect for a young driver. Good thing my boss took the day off today. Every time we work this route, something happens to him. He misses an inspection, he speeds. We inspected our locomotive, put it in service, got on the track, and got to work. We worked half of the shift without any complaints, and went to the technical parking lot for inspection and maintenance of the locomotive. We pulled into about the middle of the track and stopped. The driver sent me on my rounds and made himself comfortable and stared at his phone. I climbed down off the locomotive, carrying a flashlight, hammer, and gloves. I went around the car and made sure everything was okay. We could head back, but I decided to linger and admire the view. Moonlight, thick fog, rails stretching off into the distance, black walls of trees on either side of the railroad tracks, and a lone diesel locomotive, a majestic monster, a green metal hulk. I took a full breath of the frosty air and decided to take another look around, once again running my flashlight through the trees. I noticed a rusty sign hanging from a lower branch of one of the trees. I walked down towards the trees, lighting the way with the flashlight. After walking about 15 meters, I picked up my find. It was a plate with a diesel locomotive number, a very old diesel locomotive. Such locomotives were in operation about 40 years ago. I was looking at the find when suddenly something crunched on my right side. I turned sharply, shining my flashlight. About 20 meters away from me, two bright lights were clearly visible. I hope it's not a wolf, I thought, and the lights slowly faded and then disappeared. I got scared. I felt goosebumps from my ears to my toes. I turned around a couple of times and shone the flashlight around. No one. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. Not even the sound of a diesel locomotive running. Maybe the driver had turned off the engine and I hadn't noticed. I decided to hurry back because I was starting to freeze and I didn't want to see those lights a second time. Holding the sign under the arm of my left hand, I walked quickly through the deep snow toward the locomotive. It's safe, warm and bright there. The beast wouldn't get in. I didn't want to think about what I had seen. The branches crunched under my feet, but suddenly I heard a different kind of crunch. It sounded like a large bone, or someone's spine had broken. Pretty nasty sounding. The crunch sounded from somewhere behind me. I froze in place, standing motionless, for about 15 seconds. My legs were getting very cold. They were slowly going numb, perhaps from the cold, perhaps from terror. Then I slowly turned around. 10 meters away from me were those lights again. But now they were higher than the first time, about the height of my eyes. Now they were moving leisurely, and there was that crunch again. Now I realized what was the source of that crunch. The creature was moving its head and crunching its cervical vertebrae. The crackling of bones stopped, but it was replaced by whispers. About 10 voices were speaking at once, male and female, far and near. I even heard children's voices. They merged into a disorderly noise. It was impossible to make out what they were saying. They were getting into my head. I turned sharply and ran. I ran as fast as the deep snow under my feet and my heavy winter work clothes would allow me to run. I maneuvered between trees and jumped over holes and ravines. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I noticed that I had been running with that rusty sign clutched in my hand the whole time. But even then I didn't throw it away. I ran without feeling tired, but I became alarmed that the trees didn't end. After a couple more minutes, I ran out into the open, and I saw the railroad tracks. I ran up to them and stopped, took a deep breath and felt a little relief and calm. I felt like I was safe. But after a second, I realized I couldn't see the diesel locomotive. Pulling myself together, I assumed that I had lost my way in the woods, and the locomotive was somewhere further away and could not be seen because of the fog. I went forward, and suddenly I noticed that the rails were rusty and the sleepers were wooden and rotten. This isn't the right track. Where am I? Looking around, I saw another sign. A white, slightly rusty sign was mounted on a concrete pole, indicating what kilometer of track I was on. It had the numbers 276 painted on it. This was definitely not my track. The railroad I was working on that night was only 15 kilometers long, and it was new. As I was looking at the sign and trying to make sense of the situation, I heard a familiar sound. It was the same crunching of neck vertebrae, but now it was very close behind my back. At the same moment, cold sweat ran down my back. My whole body pulsed, and I began to fumble for the handle of the hammer that was in the pocket of my orange vest. I grabbed the tool and turned around sharply. The sign I had found in the forest finally fell out of my left hand. The creature bent its neck sharply downward and peered at the tablet. When it saw it, it slowly raised its head and smiled nastily at me. I realized that if I didn't hit this creature with a hammer now, it would eat me. I swung, ready to put all my strength into the blow, but someone did it for me. Behind the creature, a hammer like mine flashed, and a moment later, it was sticking out of the creature's head. I'll never forget the sound of the skull cracking. Any living thing would have died from such a blow, but this thing just twitched, turned its head back for a second, and fled into the forest. A man came out of the fog. It was an elderly man in an old railroad uniform, the kind they issued in the early 70s. On his head, he wore a blue cap with a shiny emblem. He had a broad, stern face with green eyes and a gorgeous white mustache. The man exhaled, brushed his hammer in the snow, and told me to calm down and put my hammer in my pocket. His words sounded like a spell, and I immediately did everything he said. I started to ask questions about what had just happened and where I was, but he just pointed in the right direction and told me that my driver was waiting for me. I turned around and went in the right direction. After a couple of kilometers, I noticed that the rails became shiny and lay on concrete sleepers. Then I saw a huge square silhouette ahead. It was my diesel locomotive. I ran into the diesel locomotive, closed all the doors and continued working. All the next day and all night I slept at home. I never slept so soundly, perhaps ever. A couple of days later, I overheard a conversation between two dispatchers. They also worked at our station. They were discussing my boss, my machinist, who was taking the day off. They were saying that they felt very sorry for my machinist and were worried about him. I later met one of these dispatchers, and asked him some questions. He told me that in the early 1960s, the place I was working that night had a long line between stations. One train driver had a wife, and she went blind and went crazy. She was 32 years old. She took her newborn baby and threw herself in front of the train. Her husband was driving that train. Strange things have been happening there ever since. Traffic lights stopped working. Children's cries are heard on the radio, and in bad weather people often see a disfigured woman with burning eyes. I asked him about other dead people on this stretch. The dispatcher looked at me with a strange, surprised look, lit a cigarette, and told me that in 1977, for some unknown reason, a train derailed on that section. The driver was killed, but the assistant driver survived because the driver pushed the assistant out of the cab. That helper was my supervisor, and the train number matched the number on the plate I found in the woods. Then I found out that my boss was not going to his brother, but to the cemetery, to his dead colleague who had saved his life. A week later, I applied for a transfer to another station. It is smaller and pays less, so I continue to work there now. A couple of days ago, at that station they found the mutilated bodies of 2 drivers and an abandoned diesel locomotive. When I heard the news, I decided to tell my story,